Leonardo da Vinci was one of the greatest artists who ever lived. He excelled in everything. He was a painter, an engineer, an inventor, and he pioneered our understanding of optics.
Leonardo had a remarkably modern mind. He saw himself as being somebody that was shaping the future.
The secret to Leonardo's success was his use of direct observation. Da Vinci believed that to really capture the likeness of a subject, he literally needed to get under their skin.
Leonardo wanted to understand how human bodies walk and see and behave. He thought, well, I have to peel back that skin and see the muscles and understand the size of the muscle and the place of the muscle and how they move.
In a damp basement of a Florence hospital, Da Vinci secretly dissected the dead. He took them apart, piece by piece, as he tried to uncover the human body's deepest secrets.
Leonardo was the first artist to carry out dissections, ever. It's really amazing. Earlier in the Renaissance, there were people interested in the human body, but no one thought about doing a dissection.
Da Vinci removed internal organs and drew detailed sketches of muscle and tissue. He then wrote a series of rules on human anatomy. He also devised a system of proportions that would allow him to draw the perfect face. Leonardo's experiments with cadavers gave him an unrivaled knowledge of anatomy, far greater than many surgeons of the day. It also gave him unusual access to broken bodies and blood, the raw materials he needed to recreate a realistic image of torture and crucifixion, just like the shroud.
In one of his notebooks written around about 1490, he refers to borrowing from somebody a specimen of a bone that had been pierced with a nail. There's only one reason to be interested in that, it's because you're studying the anatomy of crucifixion.
Da Vinci had the necessary skills. He knew enough about anatomy and about the physical muscular structure of the body. Da Vinci had all of the tools to create an image like the shroud.
Da Vinci had the skill to create this realistic image. But why would he risk eternal damnation faking such a sacred relic? The answer is Da Vinci wasn't a devout Christian. He was a man of science, not religion. Leonardo refused to live by the church's strict rules. He worked on the Sabbath, he was a vegetarian, and he dabbled in alchemy. All of these acts made him a heretic in the eyes of the church.
Faking Jesus' redemptive blood would not cause him any problems because he wouldn't have believed that he's going to be damned for it.
However, there is a problem with the Da Vinci theory. Carbon dating says the fabric of the shroud was woven between 1260 and 1390. But Leonardo wasn't born until 1452, over 60 years later. Although the cloth can be carbon dated, it's impossible for scientists to date the actual image itself. It could have been created any time after 1260. It's entirely likely that if Da Vinci was trying to recreate a 1,000-year-old burial wrap, he wouldn't have used a piece of cloth straight from the loom. He would have found material that looked ancient.
Florence was a great centre of trade in Leonardo's day. It would have been relatively easy for someone like him to get hold of old cloth.
If Leonardo did pull off this incredible hoax, how did he do it?
Leonardo didn't want to create anything that could be exposed as a painting, a drawing, a print, something that was dyed onto the cloth. He wanted to come up with something that seemed miraculous.
For the last 40 years, scientists have tried and failed to discover how the image on the Turin shroud was made. The blood flow and wounds are consistent with a man who was beaten, whipped, and crucified. But forensic anthropologist Emily Craig thinks the shape and dimensions of the body proves that this image was not left by a real man.
Anatomically, it's not correct. The arms are just too long. The fingers are too long. The head and face are not in proportion to the rest of the body. It's different height from front to back. As an anthropologist, I can pretty well guarantee that people are the same height, whether you're looking at the front or the back. And everyone that tries to explain proportions of the arm goes back to rigor mortis and the body being bent. But it's not. It's just wrong.
These imperfections intrigued art historian Nicholas Allen. He has studied the shroud since the carbon dating results were announced over 2 decades ago.
Instead of researchers trying to find out how the shroud was made, they immediately dismissed it as some meaningless hoax. And personally, I thought, well, that's not the end of it. How did they do it? So I set out to find out how it was done.
Allen believes that the key to solving this riddle lies in the man's strange dimensions. After over 20 years' research, Allen has developed a theory which explains these distortions. He believes the burial cloth is the world's first photograph.
If you look at the Shroud of Turin as it appears to the naked eye, you see a negative image of a human being. And if you take another photograph of that, you produce a positive image of that human being, which means the shroud is acting as a negative. And that in itself is a very good clue that it was made photographically.
This is one of the world's first photographs. It's of a farm building, and it was taken in 1825. But is the Turin shroud a much earlier example of a photograph? Although the camera wasn't invented until the 19th century, its forerunner, an optical device called a camera obscura, had been around since 400 BC. To test his theory, Allen sets out to recreate the shroud image by building a camera obscura. Allen hangs a life-size model of a human body outside a building. Inside, he has blacked out a room, and in the wall he has placed a round crystal lens. Allen then stretches a length of cloth over a frame. The cloth has been soaked in silver sulfate, which makes it light sensitive, just like photographic film. All the materials he uses were available in 15th century Italy, the time when Da Vinci was at the height of his creative powers. Once the lens is uncovered, the light streams into the room and projects a photographically perfect upside-down image of the body onto the linen. This is the same principle as a film camera, only here the image is projected onto light-sensitive cloth. As the ultraviolet rays from the sun hit the silver sulfate in the linen, they react and begin to change color. A permanent image of the model is slowly burnt onto the cloth.
You could say that the image is made by a form of scorching. But this scorch is not made through heat. It's made through a chemical reaction.
The process is incredibly slow. It can take up to 3 days to form an image. Once the lens is covered and the lights turned on, the projected image disappears and leaves behind a faint scorch mark. When the cloth itself is photographed, the negative reveals a detailed image of a man's body, just as it does on the shroud.
When I got my very first image, I was very, very excited because my hard work had paid off.
Allen believes that the shroud image was made using a series of lenses, 3 separate primitive photographic exposures on one sheet of linen. One for the front of the body, one for the back, and a more detailed image of the head. This would explain why the head appears to be too small for the body, and also why the front and back images are not the same size. Once the image was burnt onto the cloth, Alan thinks the artist applied real human blood to mimic the wounds of torture and crucifixion. Alan wants investigators to re-examine the shroud. He believes the linen may still hold minute traces of silver sulfate.
If there is silver bound in the linen at a level, it would be the final support for the photographic hypothesis.
If Alan is right, and the image on the Turin shroud was made using a primitive camera obscura, then Leonardo da Vinci was perfectly placed to be the man behind the lens. Leonardo was fascinated by light and lenses, and in his notebook is one of the earliest known drawings and descriptions of a camera obscura. It shows light passing through a lens, inverting, and then being projected onto a flat plane. Da Vinci called it his oculus artificialis, or artificial eye.
If anybody had the capacity and the skill to work with camera obscura or any early photographic technique, it would have been Leonardo da Vinci.
Lynn Picknett believes that Leonardo would have stopped at nothing to achieve a realistic image of a tortured and crucified man.
When we look at the man on the shroud, we are not looking at just a painted image, because it's not a painting. We're looking at a photograph of a crucified man. Leonardo took a body from one of the stock of bodies he dissected for his anatomical research, and he truly crucified it.
The body on the shroud may be one of the many cadavers that Leonardo dissected. But what about the face? Finding the perfect face for Christ amongst the decaying bodies in the morgue would have been next to impossible. So whose face did he use? The face on the cloth has become the world's enduring image of Jesus Christ. Before the Turin shroud, Jesus was depicted in a variety of different ways. Early artworks show him as clean-shaven or full-faced. In some, he has blonde hair. In others, he is short-haired. But the Turin shroud permanently fixed the image of Christ in people's minds. Whoever made this image set out to create a face people would truly believe was the Son of God. So who did the artist and master of human proportions use as the model for Christ? Incredibly, the answer may have been staring us in the face for centuries. In 1987, Lillian Schwartz, graphic consultant from Bell Laboratories, made a series of detailed scientific measurements of two faces. One was Da Vinci's painting of a young woman, the Mona Lisa. The other was his self-portrait as an old man. When Schwartz scanned the two photographs into her computer and compared the images, she made a discovery that rocked the art world.
I saw this image coming down. It was half of Leonardo and half of Mona Lisa, and it was up at the top of the head, and there were the hairlines that lined up, and then it came down slowly and the eyes lined up. It was difficult to contain myself, and by the time the nose tips, that's when I screamed.
Amazingly, the two faces lined up perfectly. All human faces are unique. No two are exactly the same. So finding a match convinced Schwartz that Da Vinci must have used his own face as a model for the Mona Lisa. The discovery was groundbreaking and proved that the Mona Lisa was the work of Da Vinci. So if Da Vinci had the audacity to use his own face for the beautiful Mona Lisa, could he have used it as the model for the man on the shroud?
Well, when I first was asked to do some analysis between Leonardo and the shroud, I said, no way, this is not going to fit his canon of proportions, it's just not connected in any way.
Reluctantly, Schwartz digitized Da Vinci's self-portrait into the computer and compared it to the shroud image. But the angle of the two faces was so different, it was impossible to compare.
They couldn't do that kind of analysis because the faces had to be oriented in the same direction.
Lillian also compared the image on the shroud with the painting Secundo Mundi. This is thought to be a lost portrait of Da Vinci. Although the eyes and the tips of the nose lined up, the mouth didn't. The results were inconclusive. It seems the identity of this man would never be revealed. But then, in January 2009, Schwartz began to analyze a different drawing by Da Vinci. This face study is one of the thousands Leonardo made as he explored human facial proportions. He was obsessed with finding the formula to the perfect face. When Schwartz measured the key features on this sketch and compared them with the measurements taken from the shroud, she was shocked by the results.
I pulled up this image that Leonardo had drawn showing his proportions on a face. I felt I wasn't going to find anything just looking at them. But then I scaled and bisected the two images to see what that would pull up.
To Schwartz's complete surprise, the proportions on the Da Vinci sketch and the shroud matched perfectly.
The eyes had lined up, and you could almost follow the top of the head around to the head of the shroud. And I kept saying, no, that can't be. But then there was the tips and the mouths, and again, it matched. I'm excited about this. I mean, I really, to discover something makes you feel really, really good.
Schwartz's discovery is further proof that Da Vinci must have had a hand in the creation of this enduring image of Christ.
There's no doubt in my mind, with all the studies I've done in the last few weeks, that the proportions that Leonardo wrote about were used in creating this shroud's face.
The match was the final piece of evidence Picknett and Prince needed to prove their theory.
It was spooky, it was jaw-dropping, and it was, I think, the most exciting thing that's ever happened to me.
It's the connection we'd always been looking for, to prove a connection between Leonardo and the shroud, but also something that superficially we almost weren't expecting, because you look at the two images, they don't look that much alike. But when you do that test with them and you find they correspond absolutely precisely.
To create the perfect face, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince think Da Vinci made a sculpture using his system of proportions. And then he took a photograph of that sculpture with a camera obscura.
If Leonardo could have known that 500 years after he died, generations of pilgrims are still crossing themselves over the image, I think he would have laughed quite a lot. And I think he would have felt that he'd succeeded in what he set out to do.
Leonardo's dissections gave him access to dead bodies and blood. His fascination with lenses and camera obscura may have led to the photographic technique. Combined with his sheer audacity and ambition, Da Vinci had every opportunity to create this mysterious image, the world's first primitive photograph.
When I see the Turin shroud, I still have a sense of awe associated with it, but it's awe for the science behind it, the method by which it was created, the ingenuity that went into it.
To this day, the image of the man on the shroud influences our idea of what Jesus looked like.
The main thing to understand about Leonardo da Vinci was that he had a hunger to leave something for the future, to make his mark for the future. I mean, not just for the sake of art or science for its own sake, but because of his ego.
Today, the Turin shroud lies undercover, shielded from prying eyes. The Catholic Church has refused any further scientific tests. Until more analysis is allowed, this image will remain one of the most fascinating and enduring mysteries of our time. But whatever theories appear in the future, they will have to explain why the face on this 500-year-old drawing and the face on the Turin shroud are identical.
Beware of false prophets, those ravenous wolves who come to you dressed in sheep's clothing. You shall know them by the rotten fruit they bear. For who can pick grapes from the thorn bush, or gather figs from the thistle? And just as the good tree bears only good fruit, and the bad tree bears only that which cannot be eaten, so also shall you know them by their fruit. And forget not that every tree which does not bear good fruit shall be cut down and cast into the fire.